Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for tuning in to History Repeating, a history talk show where we discuss crucial history that you should know. Dare we let history repeat itself? I'm your host, Meghan Hughes. Joining me is my other host, Tim Rapone.
Hello.
And today we will be discussing one of the most famous pieces of history.
We're going to be talking about fascism, which is the one we've been kind of talking about doing for a while.
One.
This is the big one. We wanted to do it right. It's not going to be I don't think we need a viewer discretion on this episode because we're going to touch on the Holocaust a little bit. We're not going to go into the more unsavory details, but it is going to be a very charged episode.
Yes.
It's a heavy one in its own way.
Talking about wars is always like that. And
not even really war. We're not really going into World War II. This is more about what fascism is and what it does. I would say
the building up to it and
yes.
fall.
I think, World War II is fascinating, but I think people kind of get the gist of that part. I think fascism, especially in the past 10 years, is a word that's thrown around everywhere, correctly and incorrectly, and to the point where no one can tell what the correct definition even is. I would wager that no one knows what the definition of fascism is. Not no one, but very few people know what it is. And so hopefully we can fill in some gaps and enlighten you on what it is and what it's like.
Welcome back. You're listening to History Repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City. Don't hit the mic.
Sorry. So, we're going to be talking about fascism and what it is. Again, it's that word you hear all the time. Most people kind of throw it around there with a very loose understanding of what it means. And some people know what it means, say it, call it out aptly. But because very few people know exactly what it is, even when it's applied correctly in the political or social space, people still scoff when you kind of say that word, even when it's used right. Because either you know it, you don't know it, or you choose to believe your own version of it. People like to say, that's not fascism because I don't want it. That's not my version of it. And it is a very hard to pinpoint reality as to what fascism is, especially if the history of it is annoying. Adolf Hitler was borderline, definitely psychotic. If Mein Kampf is a mess of a book. It is contradictory, shoddily put together, rambling of a madman in prison. And Hitler's ideas are often contradictory. What he believed in 1922 is not what he believed in 1933. So there's early ideas of Nazism that isn't the same as later ideas. And then, of course, is the fact that fascism is different from country to country. It's not the same in Italy as it was in Germany, nor is it the same as it was in Spain or in the movements that existed in France, England, and America and across the country. Fascism always comes up differently. So if you're looking for fascism, if you want to find it, it's never going to look the same. I kind of see fascism as the natural end goal of the 19th century. If you look at all of the worst aspects of the 19th century, all of the more dangerous philosophies and political practices, such as laissez-faire economics, imperialism, race science, while bad in the 19th century, inevitably something that bad would lead to something even worse like this. Hitler took a bed that was made for him in the 19th century and he took it to its end goals. So when talking about fascism, I also think it's important to recognize where it came from and what it grew out of. Continuity was very important in Nazi ideology. Everyone knows the term the Third Reich. What is the Third Reich? The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire back in the Middle Ages. The Second Reich was the German Empire in the 19th century. And the Third Reich was the Nazi regime. Putting Nazism as the natural end goal of Germany's history was very important to the political message that Hitler was putting out. So, again, that's important to recognize that to him and to Nazis, fascism was the natural outcome of the human race, of the German race specifically, not the human race, the German race. That was their natural outcome, and that's how he convinced so many people to get behind it. He said, "This is what we have to do." It's almost like a way of stripping responsibility away. It's like we have no other choice. This is what we have to do. Anyways, getting a little off topic, but yes, so what actually is fascism? I think teachingdemocracy.org has put together a nice little list that I'm going to mostly just read from. So I might ad lib here or there, but this is a almost direct quote from teachingdemocracy.org. The first point is absolute power of the state. Fascist regimes have a strong centralized government. The fascist state seeks total control over all major parts of society. Individuals must give up their private needs and rights to serve the needs of the whole society as represented by the state. So it's about sacrificing yourself for the greater good of the nation. Rule by dictator is kind of a natural extension from that. A single dictator takes control and runs and makes all the important decisions of the government. And these are often a magnetic personality and kind of like a celebrity. I mean, Hitler was, as we mentioned, he was a pretty oddball person, but he had a magnetism, charisma to him. Same with Mussolini. Even though Mussolini is very much so a joke of a person, in those early years, he had that reputation as being a strong, masculine leader, and that is what drew people to him originally until they hung him upside down and killed him. The other big one is corporatism. Fascists believe in taming capitalism by controlling labor and factory owners. Unions, strikes, and other labor actions are illegal, although private property remains, the state controls the economy. That's a little confusing, and I want to go into that a little bit more. But first, I'm going to read a few of the other points. We'll come back to corporatism. Extreme nationalism. We mentioned in our episode in World War I that nationalism was a growing sentiment in Europe in the 19th century. People became very proud of their country. This was taking it the next step further. Again, we are sacrificing ourselves for the greater good is what fascists suggested we do. The fascist state uses national glory and the fear of outside threats to build a new society based on the common will of the people. Fascists believe in action and looking at national myths for guidance rather than relying on the barren intellectualism of science and reason. The hatred for intellectualism comes from they believe that it corroded and corrupted the morality of German society or Italian society or whatever country they may be in. And they believe there's almost a rampant sort of nostalgia to any fascist speech. Italy wanted to go back to the Roman Empire. Germany wanted to go back to the First and Second Reichs. They loved plays about Germanic myths. They were obsessed with this idea of going back to the past, that we have all of our lessons there and we have degraded from what used to be a more better society. So violent traditionalism is a key component of what makes up fascism. And it's a very powerful propaganda tool. This is a quote from Adolf Hitler, actually. What the king conquered, the prince formed, the field marshal defended, the soldier saved and unified. The soldier being himself. He loved to boast that he was a soldier in World War I, although his actual involvement in the war was very little and highly exaggerated. But yes, this is again, we're seeing that continuity of the king in the Holy Roman Empire, the prince of the Prussian monarchy, the field marshal being von Hindenburg in World War I, and the soldier being Adolf Hitler. We're seeing this as a natural continuation of their histories, traditions, and legacy. And two more. Superiority of the nation's peoples. Fascists uphold the nation's people as superior to all other nationalities. It's not just pride anymore. It is the inherent belief that their nation is better than other nations. This comes from extremely bogus eugenics science from the 19th century. They took it the next step further, that it's not just a certain race that they would say superior. They'd say the German people are superior. Again, this is an extension of flaws from the 19th century of racism that Hitler then took to an unholy degree. And the last point is militarism and imperialism. Fascists believe that great nations show their greatness by conquering and ruling weak nations. Fascists believe the state can survive only if it successfully proves its military superiority in war. End quote. That is a good time to bring up that fascists, Hitler specifically, loved a sort of sense of nihilist philosophy and social Darwinism. This is the idea that arose in the late 19th century mostly to justify capitalism, that the weak are weak because that's who they are, and that it is the natural order of things that strong men would conquer the weak. So that's how they justified wars. That's how they justified rich people getting richer and richer and poor people getting poorer and poorer. If they're poor, it's their fault. If they're rich, they earned it. Even if they exploited people or took advantage of people or stole that money outright, the weak would be conquered. Adolf Hitler again took that to its extreme conclusion, and he applied that to other races. Most famously, the Jewish race. He suggested that how do you put this? That it was the natural order of things that other races would be put below the German race. And these are ideas from the 19th century that he took to horrifying conclusions, but this is where they came from. One other thing I'd like to talk about is, actually, no, I'm going to circle back to corporatism now, because I mentioned that. No, again, what is fascism? People know it as a political movement, but maybe they know it's a dictatorship, but what does it actually mean in government? Corporatism is a really fascinating part of fascism that is extremely under-talked about. It's not communism, and it's also not really capitalism. It's somewhere in between. This is a quote from Britannica. Actually, no, it's not. Excuse me. The state controlled all trade unions and employer associations. Corporations gather in a corporatist parliament to decide labor contracts and worker conditions for the betterment of the nation as a whole. Corporations decide everything in parliament. That comes from Bruminate.com. And this also is a direct quote. This created a hybrid system, sometimes described as state capitalism, corporate statism, or authoritarian capitalism. Under the fascist regime, the Italian state established a corporate state in which representatives of workers and employers were grouped into state-supervised corporations organized by sector, such as agriculture or industry. While the system was portrayed as a revolutionary alternative to both socialism and liberal capitalism, it effectively neutered independent labor unions and gave considerable power to industrial leaders. Strikes were outlawed, wages were set by state decree, and labor lost its autonomy. In Germany, exchange for state contracts, tax breaks, and suppression of unions, these firms supported the regime's militarization, Aryanization, and war efforts. So it's also important to note there that fascism really got its start with the working classes, but it really got popular and really started getting powerful once it started appealing towards industrialists and businessmen. These corporatist ideas, which gave unfair benefits to corporations and businessmen, made fascism incredibly popular with them and gave them money and power. Historian Roger Eatwall said, if a revolution is understood to mean a significant shift in class relations, including a redistribution of income and wealth, then there was no Nazi revolution. The rich got richer, and the poor generally stayed poor or even got poorer.
Would you say that corporatism is similar to a plutocracy? Possibly?
It's a little different. It could be, but it's a little different because it's more controlled by it. There is still a state, and the state still controls corporations, but it gives excess power to corporations. And part of the reason why this is so confusing is that Hitler himself. This is another direct quote from Adolf Hitler. The state has nothing at all to do with any definite economic conception or development. The state is a racial organism and not an economic organization. So that's why they favored corporatism. Hitler was more concerned about racially purifying Germany. So corporations then, therefore, would be left to decide for themselves in this corporate parliament how to best handle the economy. Hitler was more concerned about purifying the social aspects of Germany and didn't really care too much what they did. And of course, that would lead naturally to corporations taking advantage of laborers. And yeah. Anyways, next thing I want to move on to is more of the aspects of fascism and how it took power, and more of it as a movement and what it appeals to people, why people turn to it. These next 14 points, as summarized by JoshuaPsteele.com, come from Umberto Eco. He was an Italian man who actually grew up in Mussolini's fascist regime, and so he's speaking mostly as not only as a historian, but as someone who lived through this. This is his own personal experience as to what fascists are like and how they take power. The first point in his 14 points is the cult of tradition, a syncretic belief in ancient truths rejecting modern interpretations. The second is a rejection of modernism, viewing the Enlightenment and rationalism as the root of moral decline. 3 is the cult of action for action's sake, valuing action over reflection, leading to anti-intellectualism. Force disagreement is treason, suppressing dissent and critical thinking as threats to unity. This is, again, because you're supposed to put the state up before yourself. 5 is fear of difference, exploiting xenophobia and racism to unify the in-group against outsiders. 6 is the appeal to a frustrated middle class, mobilizing those feelings of the economically or socially displaced. Again, if you give them an enemy, like the Jewish people or homosexuals or Slavic people, then it will say if you tell these people that are people that are suffering economically that this group of people is your enemy, they'll believe you sometimes, and they will take violent action as necessary. Number 7 is obsession with a plot, promoting conspiracy theories to justify aggression against perceived enemies. 8, enemies are both too strong and too weak, portraying adversaries as simultaneously formidable and feeble. This both makes them something to make yourself feel better by saying you're better than them. You don't want to be part of them. You want to be part of us, and you want to fight them. But it also makes them a threat that you have to overcome. So by making your enemies both too strong and too weak, you're also empowering.
It instills that fear into
It instills
them.
that fear, but it also makes fascist supporters feel stronger about themselves. 9, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, viewing life as a perpetual warfare, dismissing peace efforts as betrayal. Again, as we mentioned earlier, fascists believe that militarism and conquering other nations was the natural social order of things, that social Darwinism at play. Number 10, contempt for the weak, glorifying strength and dismissing compassion as weakness. 11, everybody is educated to become a hero, promoting a cult of death and martyrdom. Sacrificing yourself for the greater cause is heroic, and that going to die for your country is necessary even. 12, machismo, elevating aggressive masculinity and denigrating non-conforming sexual behaviors. Fascists prey off making weak people feel strong, and I'm going to circle back to that. 13, selective populism, claiming to represent the unified will of the people, dismissing individual rights, convincing you that the state knows what's best for you. And 14, newspeak, employing an impoverished vocabulary to limit critical thought. I would love to go back to the emphasis on machismo and making people feel strong. Fascism itself is an inherently insecure ideology that prescribes violence as a remedy to its perceived weaknesses. Fascism rose up in all countries after World War I, but most in countries that were defeated or left worse off in World War I. Italy was economically not doing well after the war, and personally felt that they didn't get enough gains from the war, not enough territory gains. And so they wanted to, again, go back to the glory of the Roman Empire and stuff. And Germany was completely battered after the war, economically as well as physically. And a lot of soldiers came home upset that they lost, upset that their families are starving. They lost a war that they had very little purpose to. And Adolf Hitler gave them purpose, and he gave them an enemy to blame. So it wasn't your fault that you lost. It was the Marxists, and it was the Jewish people, and it was the homosexuals. They were the ones that lost the war for us, and we're going to stop them, and we're going to bring Germany back to its new heights. It makes them feel strong. And so you have all these insecure people that can't cope with losing a war and with their own economic instability, and it gives them an enemy to make them feel stronger. If you've ever had the displeasure of encountering someone who openly describes themselves as fascist or openly aligns with most, if not all, of the characteristics that we have discussed here, as unfortunately I have, you'll know that they love to boast about how tough they are and how masculine their beliefs make them. It really makes them feel strong. And while it's also a very, very economically and socially complex ideology, as we've discussed, I think it's very important to keep that core insecurity in line because it all stems from that. At its core, in my opinion, fascism is about an ideology that gives the illusion of strength to very weak people. If you listen to first-hand accounts of people that have met with Nazis and fascists or at World War II, they were thugs. The brown shirts were and the black shirts, which are paramilitary organizations that almost every fascist organization will end up setting up paramilitary organizations to terrorize mostly socialists, but also any left-leaning demonstration, Jewish or organizations, or whatever ethnic minority they have chosen as their enemy. And they love to just go running around streets and just mugging people and beating them up. And it's completely unruly and unorganized. And yeah, I mean, the best example of this inherent cowardice is the beer hall putsch, which was Hitler's first coup and an attempt to forcibly overthrow the Weimar Republic. And he stormed a local building of government. And the second the police started firing them, the second bullets started flying, eyewitnesses report that Hitler was one of the first people to run away and ran for his life to a nearby farm. And that comes from William L. Scherer's account of the situation in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which also a lot of information comes from that book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which gives an additionally very interesting perspective on this because he was someone who had visited Germany many times during this period of time, and he personally witnessed this sort of mass psychosis that overtook the German people when they were overrun with fascism, which is why I think it is so important to know these characteristics of what fascism is and how they appeal to people so that when you see them out in the world, because not everyone who appeals to one of these emotions is a fascist necessarily, but they are still inherently flawed viewpoints that lead to very bad things. When you see people telling you that you have an enemy that's just some group of people, when you see them appealing to that us versus them dynamic, when you see them appealing to that sense of a masculinity, it's a scam. It's all a scam. And it's a scam that absolutely ruined Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and it left them impoverished and destroyed more than the First World War ever did. And yeah, it's just incredibly important to know this stuff and to watch out for it. And again, and it's not just in Germany. It's not going to just come from the swastika. It's not just going to be talking about, not all fascists are just going to say that the Jewish people are your enemy or that the socialists are your enemy. They could be a different enemy. They're going to have a different flag. They don't even call themselves fascists. One thing that I find hilarious is that there was a huge fascist rally in Madison Square Garden in the 1930s because the fascist party in America was considerably large, which people don't realize. And they said there at that rally that George Washington was the quote-unquote first fascist. And again, you see them hijacking national myth to promote themselves. So again, that's why it's important to know that fascism isn't just German, isn't just Italian, isn't just European. It can and will come to your shores, and it will do all of these things we've described, but they will personalize it to whatever best fits their situation. Hitler preyed off times of economic downturn. In the early years of the Weimar Republic, it was very economically unstable, and that's when Hitler really started to flourish and gain his early supporters in the Nazi Party. But then in the middle part of the 1920s, they actually recovered quite a bit from the economic downturns, and the Weimar Republic had a little bit of an economic boom. And that's when Hitler started to struggle again. But then the Great Depression happened, and that's when Hitler started really picking up steam again. When things are bad, he was like a parasite that would latch to it, and he would persuade people that he was the only solution when times got tough was someone strong and tough like him, just like Mussolini did. So again, it's important to know that these things will happen and they will come to you, and to watch out for them. Oops, I just bumped the mic again.
No worries. I always think that's interesting that I guess it never fully occurred to me that fascists were so open about being fascists.
I'm so sorry. Oh, yeah. Well, nowadays it's different.
Yes.
Beforehand, there were fascist movements even in France, in England, in America, and sometimes they won seats of lower government. It's not an immediate takeover. Hitler, there were openly Nazi politicians in the Weimar Republic before Hitler became chancellor in 1933. In France, many local mayors and council members in small seats of government were part of the French Fascist Party. Oswald Meyer in Britain, who was the leader of the British Fascist Party, was incredibly popular and incredibly charismatic to a lot of English people. And It wasn't until after the war, and again, the war wasn't, people didn't really, they were very hesitant to go to war with Germany. Some people saw what Germany was doing as a good thing, that they were now getting stronger. America didn't enter the war for 2 whole years, and a lot of people were still unsure if Hitler was really their enemy or not. After the war, people obviously left with a great disdain for fascism, and so nowadays fascists are much more quiet about what they are. They tend to be more subtle. They have these dog whistles, are known as, to signify, hey, like those basically little code words or code phrases, as silly as it is, to signify that they are a fascist to other fascists in the audience, so to speak. But to everyone else who is, normal, they don't realize it's a dog whistle. So they are preaching fascist ideology and fascist beliefs to people without people recognizing that it is fascism. Again, because it is such a complex and hard to describe ideology, which is why I think this episode was so important to get out there, so that now you can recognize these characteristics, what fascism is practically and as a social movement, and that way when you hear it and you see it out in the world, you can recognize it and don't let it get the better of you. Don't believe that scam. It's very quick and easy to feel like a strong leader is what you need, that feeding those masculine urges in your body is what will be good for you, or that there really is an enemy out there that you can go and beat up and will save the whole world. Again, it's a scam, it's a con, and it's just a way for the rich to get richer and for a few people to take advantage of a whole country and inevitably lead it to destruction.
And it's another one of those things where, I guess, not so much in recent years, but within the past 2 decades or so, people have somewhat forgotten that where we are currently, and I guess this isn't a new idea, but at every point in history, people have thought, history is history. We're not a part of history. That was a long time ago. These things can't happen again because we've learned from it. If we know that history, that means we've learned from it, but not necessarily. And that's why I think understanding these red flags is important, because even if you are one individual, catching it and recognizing it is just as important as everyone else catching and recognizing it.
I believe the study of fascism, or the teaching of it, the awareness of it, has been absolutely woeful in the past 70 years. Maybe because at the time it was so bad that people didn't realize they had to be so careful in how they teached it. I mean, back in post-war 1950s, people were like, fascism is objectively awful. No one will ever do that again because it's so bad. So they'll teach it, but they didn't really teach it the correct way. Now that generation is dying off. Most people on this planet have had no personal connection to fascism at its height or to World War II, and they have forgotten just how bad it is. They've forgotten what to watch out for. They've forgotten how fascists act. And now they're seeping back out of the cracks, and it's all the more important now to know not just that fascists did the Holocaust, not just that fascists are dictators, but to know what they appeal to, what they want to do to your country, and how they hurt people.
Welcome back. You are listening to History Repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City, and we are continuing our discussion on the rise of fascism, our crash course in the history of fascism. And I'm continuing the topic with a lesser-known point in, I would say, Germany's history. And this is something that I think has been brought up within recent years because of its connections that can be drawn from what has happened. But to start, I will be talking about the Institute for Sexual Science, and I'm not sure how many people have heard about that, but it was the first of its kind in Germany. It was founded by Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a German-Jewish physician, philosopher, and sexologist. Sexology, of course, being the study of sex and sexual identity. In 1919, Hirschfeld founded the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin-Tiergarten. The institute hosted professors and physicians from around the globe in sexual research, study of intersex individuals and characteristics, study of homosexuality, as well as providing counseling and treatment for what he described as physical and psychological sex disorders. And of course, I'd say as much, if not more, than it is now, this was incredibly taboo and unheard of back then. This was a very progressive idea, despite it being in the name of science.
But I'd also like to emphasize that it was very progressive, but it was also not as unheard of as it would be afterwards. This was this was one of the better outcomes of the 19th century, that emphasis on science and research. Berlin itself was a hub for scientific research and intellectualism. A lot of great scientists and great minds came from Germany, and this research into sex and sexuality was a natural outcome of that movement, one of the better ones. And it's one of those perceived ideas of moral degradation that Hitler saw and he completely wiped out. While Hitler was removed from power in 1945 by suicide, that damage that he was done could not be undone.
Although it should be emphasized that a lot of this was taboo and unheard of.
Oh, yes, of
because of some of their methods of treatment. This was the site of some of the first gender reassignment surgery, as well as a pioneer in research into that and how to properly perform it. They did countless numbers of surgeries as well as biopsies. They hosted over 40 people working at the Institute. This is directly from the Hirschfeld website. More than 40 people worked at the Institute in many different fields: research, sexual counseling, treatment of venereal diseases, and public sex education. The Institute housed the main offices of both the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the first homosexual organization, and the World League for Sexual Reform. So this was a very large hub, and it was not condensed just inside of Germany. Continuing from the website dedicated to the history of this institute, on May 6, 1933, just over 3 months after Hitler had come to power in Germany, the institute was plundered by a mob of Nazi students. The library, together with books by many other un-German authors like Freud, Brecht, Werfel, Zweig, and others, was publicly burned for 4 days. Was publicly burned 4 days later, on May 10, 1933. The institute was closed and reopened as a Nazi office building housing various anti-Semitic organizations. Severely damaged by Allied bombing raids in World War II, it was eventually torn down together with many adjacent buildings. The location does still exist, although it is not home to the Institute anymore. That was the formal shutdown of the Institute, though, in the 1960s, and later there were many successors to it. Of course, though, not by Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was sent into exile, targeted not just for the material that he studied, but also because he was an openly gay Jewish man, which is probably the bottom of the barrel for what Nazis considered human, unfortunately. Continuing from the website, from the outset, the Institute was defamed and denounced as Jewish, social democratic, and offensive for public morals. It was plundered and shut down by the Nazis in 1933. In exile, Magnus Hirschfeld witnessed a Parisian cinema, the burning of his works on Berlin's Opera Square by fascist students. Following an unsuccessful attempt to set up an institute for sexual science in Paris, Hirschfeld died in Nice, France, on May 14, 1935, his birthday. There were other prominent physicians at the institute, such as Arthur Kronfeld, Felix Abraham, and Karl Gies, who were also forced into exile, where they there took their own lives to avoid Nazi persecution. Yet, the Nazis failed to have Hirschfeld's name and legacy erased from history. Particularly in the United States, his scientific methods had an enduring effect on sexual science. Some of his former collaborators at the Institute, such as Walter Grossman and Arthur Whale, continued their work in the USA. Hirschfeld himself had visited the United States in 1892 and in 1931 and impacted on local scientists. Harry Benjamin, a friend and colleague of Hirschfeld's, further developed his studies on transsexuality in the States. It was not until the 1960s that the topic returned to Germany. Scientists like Alfred Kinsey employed the technique of questionnaires developed by Hirschfeld between 1899 and 1925 during his research into sexual behavior of women and men in the U.S. And a lot of this information is still incredibly relevant and useful into sexual research that continues today. There's still a lot we don't know and don't understand, but it is helpful knowing what we do have remaining from this institute. So I think despite its sad ending, it is important to note that yes, this was a thing that occurred during Nazi Germany, and it is important to consider these signs and warnings so that things like this don't happen again. And I believe there is a day dedicated to Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany, or at least in Berlin, to celebrate the work that he contributed to science. So I think that's really honorable. And
Yeah, it is. That mic again.
I think you could say a happy ending, maybe.
Almost a happy ending. I don't know if I'd describe anything happy towards what has happened.
But it is good that he is recognized post-mortem.
As much as they can do to remedy the wound. That the Holocaust and how it affected homosexual people, LGBTQ people, is one of those things that I feel has been woefully uneducated in the past 70 years, particularly because being openly gay wasn't very acceptable until very recently in our own lives. And to many people in many places in the world, it still isn't. So it's an aspect of the Holocaust that people don't want to address as often. And I think it's really important to hear stories like that, because that idea that homosexuality or that being LGBTQ plus is degrading to society, that it's somehow worse, that it's dangerous, that it'll corrupt people. That's something that we hear every single day in the news, in public spaces. To this day, it's believed that gay people are somehow hurting our country.
It's that same mindset that LGBTQ people or queer people are lesser than and feeble. That it makes you weak-minded.
Yes, that they're both weaker and that they're both corrupting you, so that they're a threat. They're an active threat. That is a eugenicist idea. That is an idea that a lower minority of people is somehow corrupting your gene pool, and they need to be forcibly eliminated. And as you've shown, it started with closing down schools, closing down institutions, and burning books, but it ended in gas chambers. Not just for Jewish people, it ended in gas chambers.
That's
for
why I think
gay
it's also
people.
important mentioning, when people talk about the Holocaust, they say, 6 million people died. It was not 6 million. It was far higher than that.
12 million.
12 million, yes. Not just Jewish individuals, but homosexuals, disabled individuals, and trans people were also very popular targets.
That was all about purifying the gene pool, because Hitler believed that if they could purify the German race that had been allowed to degrade, in his opinion, that they could only then could they enhance Germany to a powerful, dominating world power. And another thing too, just as a side note, is that most of that, I believe, almost about 4 million, 5 million of those additional 6 million after the Jewish people that were targeted in the Holocaust, mostly Marxists, socialists, communist people with political beliefs, were demonized to the point that they were corrupting the gene pool and that they needed to be forcibly eliminated. That was one of their primary targets, was leftists, people with socialist ideas were demonized to the point that people believed they were better off dead, which is an idea you hear in America. Better off dead than red is something that you hear in America. These are all ideas that ended in gas chambers. They are something you need to be aware of. And what happened to that institute is a prime example of the first and early stages of what fascism inevitably leads to.
I also want to mention, for those who live in the Tampa Bay area, a lot of the information that I got on the basic facts of World War II, the Holocaust, and the rise of fascism is thanks to the Holocaust Museum in St. Pete. They are a really wonderful great
place.
museum.
I highly recommend anyone go visit it.
I took the tour back in 2018, so it has been a long time since I visited. But they have a beautiful collection of artifacts and great tour guides there who can give you a crash course in Holocaust history. So if you're interested, it is in downtown St. Pete, and they are still open. And they do have rotating exhibits upstairs. So if you're interested in other aspects of history, definitely check it out. And I would like to thank the Magnus Hirschfeld website.
Yeah, and also I think on that museum, I think keeping that physical connection to history is really important. I think too often the Holocaust in people's minds has been boiled down to numbers like 6 million, to images like the swastika, that they forget the real physical, tangible loss of human life. Museums like the St. Petersburg Holocaust Museum does a wonderful job of keeping that alive. I myself have personally met someone who liberated a concentration camp in Austria. His name was Hardinger. He was someone who was part of the American military effort to liberate Europe. And at that time, there was not many people that fully knew the extent of the Holocaust. They didn't know what they were getting into. And his description of the bodies that he saw, the train cars, a train car which the Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg actually has one of those train cars, and how he described opening that train car and seeing it filled from top to bottom of naked, dead bodies of not just Jewish people, but Jewish people, Marxists, leftists, homosexual people, anyone can seem deemed not worthy to the German mind. Having met someone, having looked in their eyes and hearing them tell it to you not just as a history story, but as a lived experience is incredibly important and life-changing.
We want to thank you for tuning in to History Repeating. You can catch us again next week, Wednesday at 1, or you can catch our previous shows on the Hawk TV YouTube channel. Thank you for listening.